So, human meaning has to be recognized in the context of actual human behavior, actual human interaction. Going back to that proverb of hell, um, eternity is in love with the productions of time. So, Blake, like the Romantics generally, are trying to give respect, reverence, and attention to temporal life, the actual human embodied experience of time, asserting that, affirming that in contrast, a resistance to what had traditionally, until before these democratic revolutions, been a hierarchical view of meaning and value. Saw meaning as transcendent, either in the realm of the church, the exclusive realm of the church, religious hierarchy, or the monarchy, or the Platonic realm of mathematical truth. All of these ways of conceiving of truth hierarchically or transcendently disparage actual embodied time. So Blake is trying to illuminate, give us a reason to pay attention and even revere, and finally relish and enjoy the actual experience of embodied life. Um, so it, this has to do with the rehabilitation of the body, the material, over and against its opposite, the soul. And I've been trying to emphasize too that this is also a way of reconceiving mechanism as enchanted, and so really key part of Blake's art is that he began his work as a copier, as an engraver who just made copies, as a mechanical an avocation as you could imagine. But and as that's to say, as mechanical an avocation as you can imagine, and the most typical avocation of a mechanized world. But he's turned this mechanism into an organ for perceiving and communicating new forms of enchantment. So, by going back to the idea of the what's infernal about this, why he needs to approach enchantment from the side, the satanic side, or the negative side, um, when by affirming the experience of temporal life, the experience of actual experience of bodies over and against the transcendent realm of meaning and value, it often means affirming the opposite. Um, Oftentimes what Blake's pointing out are the hypocrisy of meaning and language. So as we just saw in the smile of deceit, there's a smile of love and the smile of deceit. Oftentimes that's how language works. Think of love. There's an ironic way in which sometimes the most authentic expression of love is not to say anything. And there's a way in which affirming love, like the smile of deceit, makes the love dubious. Like the fact that we need to say something, the fact that we need to affirm love, to say, what I'm trying to say is maybe the deepest felt love the most unquestioned experience of love doesn't need to be said. The child's love for a parent doesn't need to affirm itself. So there's a way in which sometimes, and the romantics are uh, especially attuned to, the are we're most honest, or maybe we're most honest when we don't, in what we don't need to say, and what, and what we do need to say actually is implicitly questionable because we have to affirm it in language. So that's what I mean about paying attention to a more functional, practical, performative dimension of meaning and communication, rather than paying strictly attention to what is explicitly said. So another way of talking about, I just mentioned Ludwig Wittgenstein. He talks about the difference between saying what we explicitly say versus showing what we implicitly show. They're often at odds with one another, and one of the contraries I think that Blake is interested in. So that's I think a helpful way of thinking about his uh, characterization of his own infernal method. So he's interested in the context of actual experience of human meaning. Walking, that's what he means by walking among the fires of hell, delighted with the enjoyments of genius. So what's the actual human reality? He's talking about walking around London, just, the actual experience of the city in this passage from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And so what he's saying is human meaning, the meaning we experience in temporal life, looks to angels like torment and insanity. From the perspective of transcendent absolute truth, the world of human truth is incomprehensible. So that's as strange as Blake's, insistence on the infernal might sound. He's getting at something very precise and well thought out. And he's trying to describe the character of the nation, the actual significance and experience of the English character. The sayings used in a nation mark its character. The proverbs of hell show the nature of infernal wisdom, our embodied temporal knowledge, what it means to be us in a fully fleshed out way, not just what we explicitly pretend to know, pretending we were angels. So, and this, again, to go back to this proverb of hell, a bird, a nest, a spider, a web, man, friendship. He's talking about our web, our nest, the way in which we, through our communication, our means of transmitting ourselves, communicating, representing ourselves, creates the medium of our reality, of our truth, of ourselves. That's what he means by friendship there, and that's very central. Another organic metaphor for romanticism in general. How we create ourselves through how we communicate ourselves, how we share ourselves, how we socially bind together. Okay, and I want to go another layer here and make you notice how there are two different experiences of time involved here. That the human embodied experience of meaning, it involves a different experience of time that is more like music and dance. I've been using these analogies to describe how it's interactive. I only know what anger means by being able to point it into it at it in a particular circumstance. It's situated, like the experience of music is always situated. Um, it's a submission to immersion in a certain organization of time, certain rhythm, like reading a poem. Um, uh, this that the meaning, the experience of meaning, likewise is an experience of different kinds of experience of time. So, um, like we talk about in terms of ritual, performative, um, interactive. Um, I'm going to look at some poems now to try to illuminate what I'm saying about two different kinds of time. Um, just to introduce this, though, you might think about the difference between musical communication, rhythmic communication, and didactic communication. So the transmission of knowledge from the teacher to the student. It's information supposedly, goes from one head to the other. There's no bodily component to it. There's these two opposed ways of building meaning. Syntax, ways of talking about grammar, how sentences and narratives construct meaning and communicate meaning. Hypotaxis is like syllogisms. We have an initial premise, a secondary premise, and that builds to a conclusion. It's a cumulative construction of meaning. In narrative works in the same way, builds meaning by the cumulative effect of a series of events build up to some kind of lesson that is the moral of the tale. So, for instance, in The Fly, everything turns on this syllogism, this I think, therefore I am. It's drawing a conclusion from that if-then statement. So an abstract lesson is produced by a certain sequence of logical thinking or a certain sequence of narrative. And what Blake shows in poems like this that are interrogating certain narratives or moral dogma, the Garden of Love, the Little Black Boy, the Chimney Sweeper, the Tiger, is how embodied time gets left out. In the Garden of Love, it just turns into graves. In The Fly, he's somehow created a sense of reality and of himself where his own body doesn't matter anymore. Even as he's singing a poem, it's like I could just as well not be here. I'm singing a poem about non-existence, so he's showing how this syllogism has drawn himself out of his body into this kind of nihilistic and realm of reality that really is predicated on denigrating the body, just as in the Garden of Love. Now, in The Little Black Boy, what's interesting is that it seems like a syllogism is created in the poem to reverse the logic of racism, according to which the impure black body instead of being impure, becomes a mark of God's love. It bears the beams of uh, the God's sun shining on the boy. Um, but what's so there? It seems like that lesson is learned or taught in the poem, um, but that appearance is thrown in question, if not, belied by the ultimate conclusion of the poem, where the little black boy is left waiting for the little white boy to love him. He will then love me. He's still waiting. So even he is suspended. His own body is suspended, even though he thinks he's been released from racism. He's heard a story that tells him why he needn't be ashamed of his black body. In effect, in practice, he's still waiting for the English boy to love him. Same. Likewise, the chimney sweeper, even though it's among the songs of innocence and it bears a redemptive message, ostensibly, sort of seems like the little black boy. If you read strictly for the narrative and the sort of argument, logic of the semantic content of the poem, it seems like we're all going to heaven. There's nothing to worry about. And Tom, even though it was cold, he awoke warm. But the effect of the poem on the practical performative level, the reader sees this is delusion, that you've just talked yourself out of not noticing your dark, bleak condition, just like the little black boy. So on this topic of two different kinds of time, sort of the dogmatic time of the clock, the sort of logic, the story we tell ourselves that ignores a certain embodied experience of time. So tension between concept and music, narrative and poetry. It's a powerful little section of a speech by Martin Luther King I'd like to play for you. Let's see.
And it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words of the bad people and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right.
I think Blake is getting at something similar when he says time, eternity is in love with the productions of time. Waiting on time, change never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability, is like killing time. Passive disregard of your actual time, your actual experience of time. Out of deference to some kind of abstract narrative, inevitability, a sense of a transcendent, overriding truth you're relying on, rather than we must help time, we must do time somehow in the present. And that's why music is such a helpful analogy, if not, a literal, so often music is a literal uh, vehicle of progressive social movements, but it's also a helpful analogy for thinking about what meaningful historical action it is about, as and just meaningful behavior. It's different. It's embodied. It has to do with a certain kind of uh, embodied engagement of the environment. That Blake is always correlating with environmental sounds like the clod and the pebble, not to mention actual singing. Um, so let's look at how this plays out in some of his poems, like I think the infant sorrow, infant joy. Keywords are like piping, joy. Um, the word joy is so great in Blake. Um, uh, it's like an image of music. He turns the noun into a verb in The Little Black Boy. Together we joy. And the language of mother and child and infant joy is like the word joy becomes a refrain, a rhythm, a rhythmic kind of communication between the parent and child. Um, Turning the noun, something you think you know, joy is a thing, into something you do. Joy is what joy does. So let's look at this beautiful poem. I love he's like in his poems about animals, he's speaking like the dove's voice. He's speaking. Here's the infants, like we talked in Thel about the infant smile. So what's this? Speechless. I have no name. Like it's so paradoxical to think of he's giving speech to this speechless infant. Again, that's what infant literally means, is speechless. But he describes this dialogue, unspoken dialogue. Just I think he's translating a communication of maybe sounds between a mother and an infant, or parent and an infant, or just bodies resonating. Just like the clod and the pebble. Is that poem is like a translation of sounds in the environment. What shall I call thee? I happy am. Joy is my name. Sweet joy befall thee. Pretty joy, sweet joy but 2 days old. Sweet joy I call thee. Thou dost smile, I sing the while. Sweet joy befall thee. So it's like the parent and child cooing to one another. They're doing joy as much as, more than they're saying it. And this one's heartbreaking to read in comparison. And remember, the word piping is key word in the introduction. Piping, the angel in the cloud is piping songs. And so just that evokes music, like the dove's voice, the music in the music in the air. It's a music that goes unheard. This reminds me of the moment when we get to Frankenstein, the moment in which the creature is born, and Victor Frankenstein can only see grotesque body parts. He can't see a human expression. The creature could be smiling at him, but he can only see this mechanical, grotesque matter. That's what is described here. There's no echo of the infant hears no echo. There's no communication. It's so heartbreaking. I sulk upon my mother's breast. Um, so Blake suggests communication is always about translation. If communication is just mechanical repetition, it's not communication at all. Um, uh, this translation between bodies is what the joy, bouncing back and forth between these different voices, um, is what makes it communication. Um, so he really is emphasizing a musical conception of how communication works, and as is Martin Luther King. The time is always right to do right. So what it means to do right is somehow has to be embodied in time. To be right now in time um, has to be performatively enacted on some level. And that's what I mean by parataxis. So parataxis, rather than accumulating meaning, parataxis is rhythmic. It means parallel. I'm giving you paratactic syntax. Just gives successive examples or instances. My joy, your joy. Time is always right to do right. I'm not explaining a meaning, building a syllogism, an argument, or a narrative. I'm communicating by this kind of repetition, serial array of examples of identity within difference. So another great example of that is the introduction. So I think what's a good, interesting thing to look at here is just all the different media. So it starts with piping songs, laughter, and piping a song about a lamb, weeping, and then singing. Sing thy songs of happy cheer. So translate the music of the air on a cloud, translate the song of the air into music that you pipe on your pipe, translate that music into a song that you can sing, and then finally translate that into writing. So he's this is a paratactic series of repetitions of the same song. So the meaning of the writing finally it comes not from the syntax, the abstract meaning of the words, but from the way in which it resonates with the environment, with the body, with the musical instrument. The text is situated in this environmental array of communications media and sounds and embodied rhythms. Is he plucks a hollow reed, he writes with the environment, and the writing as if to underscore the kind of opacity of his meaning, the meaning, the abstract meaning, is paradoxical. I stained the water clear. That's I stained the water clear. I polluted the environment. sort of most obvious way to read that is I made ink from the water to write with, but it also suggests um, a counterpart of defiling the environment. So, and again, every child may joy to hear that use of the noun as a verb, emphasizing this tension between the ostensible definition, the lesson, and the practical performance of meaning. Another great example of the musical meaning, the musical construction of meaning. I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. There's something cathartic about this translation of meaning into performance, putting it outside, putting it in your body, rather than holding it. Just like that, proverb of hell, this standing water turns poisonous. The overflow is creative. The nurse's song literally acts out a kind of music seduction by music, sort of contagious rhythm. The nurse tells the children it's time to go in, it's getting dark, the night dews, the dews of night arise. It's the risk. It's like the the sick rose, the disease of night is dangerous. But the nurse allows herself to be seduced by the children's song, I like how that's announced in the title. It's the nurse's song. It's she makes it her own, and I like how this authority figure, who's begins by putting down the law, trying to impose a rule, keep night and day separate, to segregate the black and white, child and adult, the realm of play with the realm of discipline. That she is within the circle of singing children. She's depicted here on the same level, whereas in the song of experience, there's a clear hierarchy, disciplinary control, a vertical segregation that is entailed by imposing adult rule, the segregation of night and day. And in the Song of Innocence, Blake translates this equalizing, putting the nurse and children all on the same level, all participating in the same song. He translates that into the sound of his poem, including these accent markers. He makes, and concluding the poem with the word echo, he makes the sound of the poem itself illustrate. He makes this poem itself echo. The little ones leaped and shouted and laughed, and all the hills echoed. He's making us act out the very echo that he's describing. That's an important thing, I think, to keep in mind when we look at the tiger. the tiger depicts, like the little black boy, an ideological, mind-forged manacle, an inability to think of authority, creative power. Who could frame thy fearful symmetry? Otherwise than in terms of tyrannical, coercive power. So as the poem proceeds, the only examples the poet can, only metaphors for creative power you can come up with are these analogies for industrial power, mechanism, machinery, the anvil, the chain, the hammer, the furnace. So it shows how the speaker of the poem, his mind is prescribed, his imagination is ideologically limited and prescripted to thinking about power as tyrannical and coercive, and vertical, hierarchical, which keeps him from actually even seeing the tiger finally. This conception of the fearful symmetry becomes finally blinding. And all the poet can conceive by the end is this unfathomable creative power. Who dare frame thy fearful symmetry? This switch in the course of the poem. Who could? It's just a question more of curiosity, wondering, maybe paying attention to the tiger. What could be the cause? By the end of the symmetry, end of the poem, it's who dare the fearful symmetry. It's moved from something, potentially just awesome, that and curiosity provoking, to simply terrifying, and audacious, expression of a kind of only exclusively intimidating power. So it's a poem about a kind of paranoia, or how, like the little black boy, an ideological discipline of time and experience and of the body is prescribing the poem's imagination and experience. Another thing to notice here, just talking about the echo, the rhythm, the experience of music, is the trochaic beat of the poem. Tiger, tiger, burning bright, is very evocative of the heartbeat that is being interrogated. So that, which is to say, again, we in our experience of the poem are the creators. We're the ones that are making the heartbeat. And the narrative, that the questioning is alienating ourselves from our own bodies, again, much like in The Little Black Boy. So these conflicts between knowing and doing parallel a conflict or tension between the hypotaxic building of some kind of cumulative meaning, that's finding a message or lesson, a moral lesson of the story that sort of binds time, holds time, resolves time into some kind of lesson, message, or meaning that transcends it, versus paratactic. Paratactic syntax derives meaning or keeps meaning correlated with the rhythm of speech, the sort of serial stream of words, of speaking, rather than suspending it in a transcendent meaning. So in the terms of the Garden of Love, the church binds my joys and desires turns it, kills them by turning it into, um, defining it in terms of a moral dogma. Likewise, knowing binds time. Uh, in suspends the pleasure of language, the pleasurable music, um, joys and desires that are embodied in a kind of rhythm of music. So I was talking about how, the nurse's song, the nurse is kind of seduced. She tries to discipline the children's song, but then becomes part of the song. The lamb is even more nuanced, and as simple as it is, powerful, I think, deconstruction of this hierarchical relationship of the nurse to the children, the teacher to the student. The lamb satirizes the teacher-student relationship. It begins with this kind of catechism, that is to say, rhetorical questioning. Little lamb, who made thee? It's the kind of questions they ask little kids in school. Like, there's an answer, there's a correct answer you're supposed to know. I'm not asking because I want to know the answer. I'm asking if you know the correct answer. It's like a catechism in church, a kind of mechanical rehearsal of a prescribed question and answer. But in this case, it's the child that's asking the question. So he's subverting the usual scenario where it's the teacher asking it of a child. But at first it seems he's maintaining a kind of hierarchy because it's the child asking it of even lower positioned animal on the hierarchy. Little lamb, he's actually asking a lamb if he knows who made thee. And you can see the paratactic form, this repetition, it's mimicking catechism or rhetorical questioning in class. But the poem in the second stanza reverses and then complicates this hierarchy and turns it into a kind of waltz. So he says, you made you, you are God. So all of a sudden, the lowest position on the hierarchy, the lamb, becomes the highest position. And it's so simple, and yet it's incredibly moving, I think. He became a little child, I a child, and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. So it's like God, animal, child, all become interchangeable positions in a kind of musical rhythm. It's a rhythm of thinking and of desire, imagining God. I find that imagining God and experiencing the earth, the animal embodiment, are all put into a kind of musical patterning. So, little lamb, God bless thee. Who's saying that to who? It's a phrase that we're all participating in together. And I think the lack of punctuation here, lamb, God, thee. I'm commanding. I'm asking for this blessing, but I'm also the child. He's a child, thou a lamb. So, who's talking to who? About whom? It's all scrambled in a way that's beatific. It's psychedelic. That sense of dissolving into the environment has a kind of erotic and religious uh, overflowing, to use Blake's term. So Blake, he learns from the same ideology of hierarchy, of pedagogy, the church dogma. He learns from it by subverting it. He deconstructs the ideological presumption of a hierarchy, the teacher just pretending through these rhetorical questions to instruct the child in obedience to the hierarchical obedience to the Lord. That ideological structure, that vertical structure, is integral to, is deconstructed, but he uses it to create this kind of dance of interchangeable positions in the hierarchy. Lamb and child and God all become teacher and student. He takes this ideological hierarchy and turns it into a music of exchanging positions on it. So it's like the Cloud and the Pebble. He's using, just as in that poem, he starts out with a stark binary, conceptual binary between being selfish and being selfless. But the examples he uses for that seem at first to reinforce the hierarchy. The Clod and the Pebble turn out to deconstruct it, because we realize there are complexities in the illustration of the dogma that are at odds with the dogma and that end up deconstructing it. So it's, in a way, it's like our sensuous experience is more intelligent than our ideas that are supposed to understand our sensuous experience. Same thing here. This is even, I think, more subtle and interesting in its juxtaposition of time, temporal life, embodied life, and transcendence. Begins by saying, weary of time, who countest the steps of the sun. So the sunflower just has its eye on eternity, like a monk or something. I'm weary of time. I forswear the earthly existence in time. I'm just have my eye on eternity, on the sweet golden climb where the traveler's journey is done, the end of life. But then the way in which that endpoint, the opposite of time, eternity, when time is over, the hereafter, the way in which that hereafter is illustrated or evoked, the metaphors just keep reintroducing time. So then we get like a rhythm again, like God and the Lamb. The more we try to evoke the opposite of time, the hierarchy, the after, sweet hereafter, the more we're put back into time as a kind of rhythm. Where the youth pined away with desire, and the pale virgin shrouded in snow, arise from their graves and aspire where my sunflower wishes to go. So I hope you can get a sense of how, like, the poem turns in on itself. trying to evoke the end point of time, the afterlife, this realm of eternity where the youth and the virgin are sort of immortalized, this immortal love. But even to conceive them is to resurrect them. They arise and aspire to their own further sun. Turns into a rhythm of perpetual resurrection and reimagining, just like the Lamb and God and child. This is even grammatically evoked in this juxtaposition of the youth and the virgin. Look at all the words, all the different ways in which Blake evokes the activity of desire, seeking, counting, journeying, traveling, pining. In this little poem, arising, aspiring. This little poem about the hereafter is saturated with desire, as if, with sunlight. And that there's a kind of grammatical contortion here that I think is really amazing, where the youth pined away with desire and the pale virgin shrouded in snow. Does that sound a little off? Like the youth pined, that's an active, expression of desire, where the virgin shrouded. It's a passive reception of the snow, but it's as a symmetrical counterpart to the pining of the youth. That we read it as if it were active. So again, we're learning from the reading of the text, from the grammar, the complications, the tensions in the narrative, complicate what its ostensible message, what seems to be clear, story about just waiting for the afterlife. Turns out to be anything but, just saturates us in the body, in the here and now, in the movement of desire, of perpetual wishing, aspiring, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to end with a couple videos about Blake's process and the actual mechanical process by which he produced his work, which was actually very innovative, as I've mentioned, and his investment in London, the rhythm and material reality of London life were so integral to his thought and work. So I really want to suggest how much I think these videos suggest how much he was learning from his environment, taking from his environment, and incorporating it in his poetry.
Blake was an extraordinary original when it came to his thinking, his emphasis upon imagination, his antipathy toward, for example, to use but perhaps one of his best known expressions, the dark satanic mills, the grinding, the machinery, all these things that seem to dehumanize his fellow man. And there, right in the middle of his life, is this machine, this large, lumping, huge, wooden, heavy machine with this great star wheel that takes enormous pressure to turn and that creaks like a sailing ship and is absolutely at the center of his life. He's not a Shelley or a Wordsworth or a Keats with a fine quill pen and ethereal thoughts staring up to heaven and glancing through his manuscripts and leisurely leaning back and contemplating what he's written and then passing it to his publisher to put it into press. Blake is a mechanic. He's this extraordinary man who is physical. Blake was not a big man, but he was enormously strong, enormously powerful. Yet, the creator of these extraordinary ideas and these extraordinary poems that just go right to the quick of our imagination and our heartthrob as human beings.
He sang his poetry, always, whenever he got the chance to. We don't know exactly what melodies he employed, but we know he would sing to friends. He'd sing at parties, he'd sing to his wife and sing to, in gatherings. In a sense, he thought of himself as a bard. Now, it's important to remember that for him, the bardic voice was something very, very central. It was almost the origin of his genius. He had read the Bible as a child. He had read Milton. And he thought in combining the Bible, combining Milton, he was creating a public voice and a prophetic voice which would reawaken the spiritual longings of the English people.
But the soul of sweet delight can never be defiled. To create a little flower is the wisdom of ages. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee. On a cloud I saw a child, and he smiling said to me,
Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed, and I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear. And I wrote my happy songs, every child may joy to hear.
Blake himself used instruments of the day, probably the church organ or the pump organ or harmonium. And what I have here in my lap is a miniature pump organ. It has a bellows and keys. It has 2.5 octaves. So it's probably not that different from the instrument that Blake may have used.
He was an 18th century Londoner in an 18th century setting. So what was he listening to? Street ballads, popular songs, the Methodist hymns of the period, all the songs and airs in the air around him. And those are precisely the sources from which some of his great lyrics spring.
There was a lass of Islington, as I've heard many tell, and she would to fair London go find apples and pears to sell. And as along the streets she flung with her basket on her arm, her pears to sell, you may know it right well, this fair made men no harm.
Blake was the greatest poet of London in the sense that its sounds and sights and images and words reverberate through his prophetic books as well as through his lyrics. But for him, London was not just the city of the poor and the repressed, as it was, but it was also the city he called Infinite London, spiritual fourfold London. He saw eternity in the streets of London. For him, it was a visionary city as well as a real city, and he could understand the visionary truth of his own imagination, even as he walked through the streets of London.
I behold London, a human awful wonder of God. He says, return, Albion, return. I give myself for thee. My streets are my ideas of imagination. I write in South Molton Street what I both see and hear. I see thee, awful parent land, in light. Behold, I see.
When I was a child, I had a similar experience where I was on, I think it was Kingsway. And I was walking down Kingsway, and very suddenly, the people walking through the streets the traffic, the hive of movement, suddenly was transformed into lines of light, which seemed to have some ulterior and grander movement, which I didn't quite understand. But I was realized at that time that London itself could be seen as an organism, and Blake himself has the very same sense. So for him, London was a spiritual reality. It was part of the divine vision.
The fields from Islington to Marylebone, to Primrose Hill and St. John's Wood were builded over with pillars of gold, and there Jerusalem's pillars stood.